The control tower at Edwards Air Force Base fell silent as Captain Sophia's voice crackled through the radio, steady despite the chaos surrounding her at 30,000 feet. "Tower, this is Viper 2-1. I've got multiple system failures, no hydraulics, and my landing gear won't deploy. I'm coming in hot." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, each syllable carrying the weight of what everyone in that tower knew but wouldn't say aloud. This was likely a death sentence. Major Tom Rodriguez, the flight controller on duty, gripped his headset so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He'd been doing this job for 15 years, had talked dozens of pilots through emergencies, but something about Sophia's voice, that unnatural calm, made his stomach churn with dread. "Copy, Viper 2-1, Rodriguez responded, his own voice betraying none of the fear coursing through him. "We're clearing the runway now. Emergency crews are standing by." Through the tower's reinforced windows, Rodriguez could see the organized chaos beginning below. Fire trucks raced across the tarmac like red beetles, their sirens creating a symphony of urgency that seemed to mock the clear blue California sky. Ambulances followed close behind, their crews already knowing they might be racing against time itself. The sight was both reassuring and terrifying. All that equipment, all those trained professionals. Yet Rodriguez knew that when Sophia's F-16 Fighting Falcon hit that runway without landing gear, it would be her skill alone that determined whether she walked away from the wreckage or became another name on the memorial wall. In the cockpit of her damaged aircraft, Sophia's hands moved with practiced precision across instruments that were failing one by one. The heads-up display flickered intermittently, casting ghostly green shadows across her face mask. She'd been flying for 8 years, had logged over 2,000 hours in various aircraft, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. The irony wasn't lost on her. 6 months ago, her squadron commander, Colonel James Hartwell, had recommended against her promotion to flight leader, citing concerns about her emotional fragility and questioning whether she possessed the necessary psychological fortitude for high-stress combat situations. The memory of that performance review burned in her mind even now as she fought to keep 17 tons of damaged fighter jets stable in increasingly turbulent air. Hartwell's words echoed with cruel precision. "Captain Chen shows exceptional technical skill, but lacks the mental toughness required for critical decision-making under extreme pressure. I recommend she be considered for ground-based positions where her analytical abilities can be better utilized." Those words followed her for months, whispered in mess halls and briefing rooms by pilots who saw her as proof that the military's push for diversity had gone too far. They called her Glass Sophia behind her back, a nickname that stung, not because it was cruel, but because she sometimes wondered if they were right. She was small, barely 5'4", and weighing less than most of the gear her male counterparts carried. And she'd always been quiet, preferring to let her flying speak for itself rather than engaging in the aggressive bravado that seemed to define fighter pilot culture. But as Sophia executed a series of test maneuvers to assess her aircraft's capabilities, feeling the F-16 respond sluggishly to her commands, she realized that all those doubts and whispers had been preparing her for exactly this moment. The voice in her headset crackled again. This time it was Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the base commander, who had rushed to the tower when word of the emergency spread. "Sophia, this is Mitchell. What's your fuel situation?" She glanced at her fuel gauge, one of the few instruments still functioning reliably. "I've got about 20 minutes of flight time remaining, ma'am. Maybe 25 if I'm conservative with my throttle." 20 minutes. The number settled in the tower like a weight, pressing down on everyone present. Rodriguez began running calculations in his head, approach patterns, emergency procedures, the time needed to clear civilian air traffic from a 50-mile radius. It would be tight. Impossibly tight, but it might just be enough. In the years that followed, many people would ask Sophia what she was thinking during those crucial minutes as she circled above Edwards, preparing for an approach that violated every safety protocol in the book. The truth was, her mind had become remarkably clear, as if the chaos around her had burned away everything non-essential, leaving only pure focus. She thought about her father, Dr. David Chen, a surgeon who had emigrated from Taiwan with nothing but his medical knowledge and an unshakable belief that precision and preparation could overcome any obstacle. In surgery, he had told her when she was 12, watching him practice suturing techniques on pieces of fruit in their kitchen, "There is no room for panic. Panic is what kills patients. Calm hands and a clear mind, these are the tools that save lives." Sophia's hands were steady now as she began her descent, following a flight path that existed nowhere in any manual. She was essentially inventing a new way to land a fighter jet, using a combination of aerodynamic principles, mechanical intuition, and what could only be described as controlled desperation. The F-16 wasn't designed to land on its belly. The aircraft's structure would absorb tremendous stress, fuel lines could rupture, and the friction heat could ignite anything combustible. From the ground, Staff Sergeant Lisa Williams watched through binoculars as Sophia's aircraft appeared as a dark speck against the afternoon sky. Williams had been Sophia's crew chief for 3 years, and she knew that F-16 better than anyone except Sophia herself. She'd personally inspected every bolt, every wire, every system component during the pre-flight check just 4 hours earlier. The aircraft had been in perfect condition. So what had gone wrong? The radio chatter continued, a constant stream of technical updates and encouragement from ground control, but Sophia had begun to tune it out. She was entering what pilots called the zone, that mystical state of consciousness where training, instinct, and pure will merged into something approaching transcendence. Her breathing had slowed. Her heart rate had actually decreased despite the mortal danger she faced, and her vision had sharpened to an almost supernatural degree. As she descended through 15,000 feet, Sophia caught sight of something that made her breath catch in her throat. There, painted on her left wing in faded yellow letters, was a name, Eleanor. She'd forgotten about that, a tradition among pilots to name their aircraft after someone important to them. Eleanor Chen had been her grandmother, a woman who had survived the Japanese occupation of Taiwan, had raised 6 children while working in a textile factory, and had lived to see her granddaughter become the first person in their family to serve in the American military. Eleanor Chen had died 2 months before Sophia received her wings, but not before making her granddaughter promise something. "Be strong like bamboo," she had whispered in her hospital bed, her voice barely audible above the machines keeping her alive. "Bamboo bends in the storm, but never breaks. It is not the strongest tree, but it is the one that survives." At 10,000 feet, Sophia's aircraft began experiencing what pilots euphemistically called adverse flight characteristics. Without hydraulics, her control surfaces were operating on manual reversion, requiring enormous physical strength to maintain even basic control. Each adjustment to her flight path demanded everything she had, her arms burning with the effort of wrestling the stick into compliance. Sweat had begun to fog her visor, despite the cockpit's environmental controls, and she could taste copper. She had bitten through her tongue without realizing it. The runway at Edwards stretched out below her like a concrete river, surrounded by the geometric patterns of taxiways and the organized chaos of emergency vehicles. From her current altitude, the base looked like a child's toy, perfectly ordered and impossibly small. It was difficult to believe that thin strip of asphalt represented her only chance of survival. "Viper 2-1, you're cleared for emergency approach." Rodriguez's voice came through her headset, professional and calm despite the magnitude of what he was authorizing. "Wind is light and variable, visibility unlimited. Emergency crews are in position." Sophia acknowledged the transmission with a brief "Roger," but her attention was focused entirely on the approach ahead. She had one chance. There would be no go-around, no second attempt, no margin for error. Everything she had learned, every hour of training, every flight she had ever taken had led to this moment. The irony struck her again. The fragile pilot, the one who deemed too emotionally unstable for high-pressure situations, was about to attempt something that would test the very limits of human skill and courage. As she descended through 5,000 feet, Sophia's radio crackled with an unexpected voice. Colonel Hartwell, the same man who had questioned her psychological fitness just months earlier. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that transcended their professional relationship. "Sophia, you've got this. Trust your training." The message was brief, but it represented something profound. Acknowledgement, perhaps even respect, from a man who had never believed in her capabilities. Sophia didn't respond. She couldn't spare the attention for conversation, but somewhere in the depths of her consciousness, she registered the words and drew strength from them. 2,000 feet. The runway was growing larger now, its details becoming clearer. Sophia could see the emergency vehicles lined up along the sides and could make out the tiny figures of ground personnel watching her approach. Each of those people represented someone's life would be changed by the outcome of the next few minutes. Rescue workers who would either celebrate a miracle or carry the weight of failure. Controllers who would either witness history or live with the memory of a tragedy they couldn't prevent. At 1,000 feet, Sophia began her final approach sequence, her hands making minute adjustments to maintain the precise glide path that would give her the best chance of survival. The aircraft was fighting her now, wanting to stall, wanting to roll, wanting to do anything except glide smoothly toward the runway. But Sophia had found her rhythm, had become one with the machine in the way that only comes from years of practice and an absolute refusal to surrender to fear. The ground rushed up to meet her, and in those final seconds before impact, Sophia, the pilot deemed too fragile for combat, too emotionally unstable for leadership, performed one of the most remarkable feats of flying in military aviation history. She didn't know it yet, but her landing would be studied in flight schools for decades to come, analyzed frame by experts trying to understand how she had accomplished the impossible. But in that moment, as her damaged F-16 touched down on Edwards Air Force Base with a shower of sparks and a grinding roar that could be heard for miles, Sophia was thinking of bamboo bending in the wind, of steady hands in an operating room, and of a grandmother's whispered promise that strength comes not from never falling, but from always getting back up. The question that lingered in the control tower, in the minds of every person who witnessed that landing, was simple yet profound. How had the pilot everyone considered too fragile managed to accomplish what seemed impossible? The answer, they would soon learn, lay not in Sophia's supposed weakness, but in a strength that had been hiding in plain sight all along. Sophia had never intended to become a fighter pilot. As a child growing up in Sacramento, she had dreamed of following her father into medicine, spending countless hours in his study, surrounded by anatomy textbooks and medical journals. Her bedroom walls were covered not with posters of jets or military heroes, but with detailed diagrams of the human circulatory system and photographs from the Hubble Space Telescope. She was the quiet kid who excelled at math and science, who spent recess reading instead of playing sports, who preferred the solitude of the school library to the chaos of the cafeteria. The transformation began during her sophomore year at UC Davis, where she was majoring in biomedical engineering with plans to attend medical school. She had joined the Reserve Officer Training Corps almost by accident. Her roommate needed someone to attend an informational meeting with her, and Sophia had agreed reluctantly. She sat in the back of the lecture hall, planning to leave early, when the guest speaker took the podium. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Storm Rodriguez had been one of the first women to fly combat missions in the F-16, and her presence commanded attention in a way Sophia had never seen before. She spoke about precision, about the marriage of human intellect and machine capability, about pushing the boundaries of what was considered possible. Flying fighters, Colonel Rodriguez had said, her eyes scanning the room of potential recruits. Flying fighters is surgery performed at Mach 2. It requires the same steady hands, the same clear thinking, the same refusal to panic when everything goes wrong. The difference is that when a surgeon makes a mistake, they lose a patient. When a pilot makes a mistake, they become patient. Sophia had walked out of that meeting with a new understanding of what she wanted to do with her life. Flying wasn't the adrenaline-fueled adventure story she'd seen in movies. It was science made manifest, engineering principles tested at the very edge of human capability. It was, in its own way, a form of medicine, requiring diagnosis of complex problems under extreme pressure and the implementation of precise solutions with life-or-death consequences. The transition from pre-med student to Air Force cadet hadn't been easy. Sophia's parents, while supportive, couldn't hide their confusion and worry. Her father, Dr. David Chen, had built his medical practice through meticulous attention to detail and conservative decision-making. The idea of his daughter voluntarily placing herself in harm's way, of choosing a career path defined by controlled violence and calculated risk, challenged everything he understood about safety and success. You could save lives as a surgeon, he had argued during one of their many late-night conversations in his study. Why choose a path where your life is constantly in danger? Sophia's answer had evolved over the years, but its essence remained constant. I want to protect the people who protect others. Flying doesn't just fly jets, Dad. We create the conditions that allow doctors and teachers and engineers to do their work in safety. We're the umbrella that keeps the rain from falling on everyone else's parade. Flight school had been a revelation and a trial by fire. Sophia discovered that her analytical mind, the same quality that made her excel at organic chemistry and differential equations, translated beautifully to aviation. She could visualize aircraft systems in 3 dimensions, could troubleshoot mechanical problems with an intuitive understanding that impressed her instructors. Her academic scores were consistently in the top 5% of her class. But the social dynamics of military aviation proved more challenging. Fighter pilot culture was built on aggressive confidence, on the ability to project absolute certainty even in the face of uncertainty. Sophia's quiet competence was often misinterpreted as lack of confidence, her thoughtful approach to problem-solving seen as hesitation. She didn't engage in the locker room bravado that seemed to define her male classmates, didn't participate in the elaborate storytelling sessions where pilots recounted their exploits with increasing embellishment. Her call sign, Whisper, had been assigned during her first week of advanced training. She had been working through a complex navigation problem in the simulator when her instructor, Captain Jake Hammer Morrison, had made a mistake in his calculations that would have sent their simulated aircraft into restricted airspace. Sophia had noticed the error immediately, but had mentioned it quietly, almost apologetically, rather than announcing it with the forceful confidence expected in military culture. "You've got to speak up, Chen," Morrison had said after the simulation ended. "In this business, whispering gets people killed." The call sign stuck, and with it came an association with weakness that Sophia found difficult to overcome. Her peers respected her technical abilities, but questioned her leadership potential. She was the pilot they wanted on their wing during complex training exercises, the one whose attention to detail had prevented numerous small disasters from becoming large ones. But she wasn't the pilot they imagined leading them into combat. The pattern continued through her years at Edwards Air Force Base. Sophia excelled at every technical aspect of her job: aircraft systems, weapons employment, emergency procedures, navigation. Her maintenance records were spotless, her flight performance consistently above average, her written evaluations glowing with praise for her analytical abilities and attention to detail. But something was missing, some indefinable quality that separated good pilots from great ones, technical experts from natural leaders. Colonel Hartwell's performance review had crystallized years of subtle doubt into harsh reality. Captain Chen represents the danger of prioritizing diversity over merit, he had written in a confidential assessment that Sophia wasn't supposed to see, but had glimpsed accidentally during a visit to the squadron office. She lacks the aggressive instincts necessary for combat leadership and appears to overthink situations that require immediate action. Her flying is technically proficient, but lacks the intuitive decisiveness that defines exceptional fighter pilots. The words had cut deeply, because Sophia feared they might be true. She did overthink things. She analyzed problems from multiple angles, considered contingencies that other pilots dismissed as unlikely, prepared for scenarios that her peers insisted would never occur. She approached flying the way her father approached surgery, with exhaustive preparation, methodical execution. But in fighter pilot culture, this careful approach was often viewed as evidence of timidity rather than wisdom. Sophia's daily routine at Edwards reflected her methodical nature. She arrived at the squadron building each morning at 05:30, a full hour before the official duty day began. This early arrival allowed her to review weather reports, study mission briefings, and conduct thorough pre-flight inspections without the pressure of rushing to meet scheduled takeoff times. Other pilots often joked about Whisper's morning ritual, but Sophia knew that her careful preparation had prevented more than one potential disaster. Her pre-flight inspections were legendary for their thoroughness. While other pilots conducted cursory walk-around checks, Sophia examined every external component of her aircraft with the focus of a forensic investigator. She ran her hands along control surfaces, feeling for loose rivets or stress cracks, peered into engine intakes with a flashlight to check for foreign object damage, and verified the security of every external store and antenna with a gentle tug that had become second nature. Staff Sergeant Lisa Williams, her crew chief, initially found Sophia's inspection routine excessive. "Ma'am, I've already checked everything 3 times, Williams had protested during Sophia's first week with the squadron. "The aircraft is good to go." But Sophia had continued her detailed examinations, explaining that she wasn't questioning Williams's competence. She was learning her aircraft's individual characteristics. Every F-16 was slightly different, with unique quirks and tendencies that could only be discovered through intimate familiarity. Over time, Williams came to appreciate Sophia's approach, recognizing that the pilot's obsessive attention to detail reflected not distrust, but genuine care for the machine that would carry her into harm's way. This same methodical approach extended to Sophia's flying style. She studied weather patterns with the intensity of a meteorologist, memorized emergency procedures until she could recite them in her sleep, and practiced unusual attitude recoveries until the responses became instinctive. When other pilots were in the bar recounting their latest aerial adventures, Sophia was in the squadron's planning room, studying approach plates and emergency checklists, preparing for situations that might never occur. Her personal life reflected the same careful approach. Sophia lived alone in a small apartment off base, its walls lined with technical manuals and aviation magazines. She cooked her own meals, maintained a strict exercise routine, and spent evenings reading everything from aerospace engineering journals to historical accounts of famous aviation incidents. Her social interactions were limited, but meaningful. She maintained close relationships with a small circle of friends who appreciated her quiet intelligence and dry sense of humor. The loneliness was real, though Sophia rarely acknowledged it, even to herself. Fighter pilot culture was intensely social. built around shared experiences and mutual trust that developed through countless hours of training and conversation. Sophia's reluctance to engage in the aggressive banter that defined squadron social life left her perpetually on the periphery, respected but not truly included. She was the pilot others turned to for technical advice but not personal conversation, the one whose competence was beyond question but whose friendship remained elusive. Her relationship with her family provided some comfort, but also highlighted the growing distance between her military life and civilian world. Her parents called weekly, their conversations following a predictable pattern. Questions about her safety, updates on relatives in Taiwan, gentle suggestions that she considered transitioning to a safer career field. Sophia loved her parents deeply, but found it increasingly difficult to explain why she had chosen a life they couldn't understand, why she found meaning in a profession they saw as needlessly dangerous. Her father's concerns weren't entirely unfounded. Sophia had experienced several close calls during her years at Edwards, incidents that were routine in the context of military aviation but would have been catastrophic in civilian life. Engine failures, electrical malfunctions, weather emergencies. Each incident had tested her skills and reinforced her belief that preparation and careful thinking were the keys to survival. But they had also added weight to her reputation as someone who attracted trouble, even though her careful flying had actually prevented these incidents from becoming disasters. The morning of her emergency landing had begun like any other. Sophia arrived at the squadron building at her usual early hour, finding the parking lot nearly empty except for the security police vehicle making its routine patrol. The duty officer's desk was unmanned. She was the only pilot crazy enough to show up this early on a routine training day. Sophia used her key card to enter the building, the fluorescent lights flickering to life automatically as motion sensors detected her presence. Her first stop was always the weather office, where she studied the latest forecasts and satellite imagery with the focus of a scholar examining ancient texts. The weather was perfect: clear skies, light winds, unlimited visibility. The kind of day when flying felt less like work and more like pure joy. Sophia made notes on a small pad she always carried, recording wind speeds and directions at various altitudes, cloud bases and tops, and expected turbulence levels. Next came the mission briefing materials, which she studied with the same intensity she had once reserved for medical textbooks. Today's flight was a routine proficiency sortie: basic fighter maneuvers, weapons systems training, and emergency procedures practice. Nothing dangerous, nothing experimental, just the kind of regular training that kept pilots sharp and current. Sophia reviewed the planned route, identified potential hazards, and mentally rehearsed the various procedures they would practice. Her aircraft for the day was tail number 880416, an F-16C that she had flown dozens of times before. Sophia pulled the aircraft forms, the official record of every maintenance action, inspection, and flight, and reviewed them page by page. The jet had flown twice in the past week without incident, had received a routine inspection 3 days earlier, and showed no signs of mechanical problems. Everything looked perfect, exactly as it should. When Staff Sergeant Williams arrived at 0630, she found Sophia in the hangar, already conducting her external inspection of the aircraft. The crew chief wasn't surprised. Sophia's thorough approach to pre-flight checks had become legendary throughout the maintenance squadron. Williams watched as the pilot examined each external component with practiced efficiency, her hands tracing familiar paths along the aircraft's surfaces. "Morning, ma'am," Williams said, her breath visible in the cool morning air. "Aircraft's ready to go. We replaced the landing light yesterday, but everything else is exactly as he left it." Sophia nodded, continuing her inspection. "Thanks, Sergeant. Did you run an operational check on the landing gear after the light replacement?" "Yes, ma'am. I cycled it 3 times, all indications normal. Gear pins are stowed, safety switches are properly positioned." This routine exchange represented more than professional courtesy. It was a ritual of trust between pilot and crew chief, a mutual acknowledgement that both women understood their shared responsibility for mission success and flight safety. Williams took pride in maintaining her aircraft to the highest standards, and Sophia's thorough inspections were a form of validation, proof that her work was being carefully reviewed by someone who understood its importance. As Sophia completed her external inspection and began reviewing cockpit procedures, she felt the familiar sense of anticipation that preceded every flight. This was the moment she treasured most, the quiet preparation before engine start, when the aircraft was still earthbound but full of potential energy, when the challenges ahead existed only in imagination and careful planning. In a few hours, she would be back on the ground, the mission complete, another successful flight logged in her records. She had no way of knowing that this routine training flight would become the defining moment of her career, the test that would prove once and for all whether the quiet, methodical pilot known as Whisper possessed the skills and courage necessary to overcome the impossible. The journey from pre-flight inspection to emergency landing would reveal truths about Sophia that even she didn't fully understand. That her careful preparation wasn't weakness, but wisdom, that her quiet confidence wasn't hesitation, but strength, and that the very qualities her peers saw as limitations were actually the source of her greatest capabilities. The first sign of trouble came 37 minutes in to what should have been a routine training flight. Sophia was conducting weapons systems training at 25,000 feet, running through simulated engagements with electronic targets when her primary flight display began showing intermittent warnings. The master caution light flashed briefly, just long enough to catch her attention, then darkened again, as if the aircraft were having second thoughts about alerting her to a problem. Viper 2-1, this is Control. We're showing intermittent data drops from your transponder. Are you experiencing any electrical issues?
Sophia's eyes swept across her instrument panel with practiced efficiency. Everything appeared normal. Engine parameters steady, flight controls responding properly, navigation systems functioning correctly. But she had learned to trust her instincts, and something felt wrong. There was a subtle vibration in the control stick that hadn't been there during takeoff, a barely perceptible change in the way the aircraft responded to her inputs. "Negative on electrical issues, Control," Sophia responded while continuing her instrument scan. "I'm showing normal indications across the board, but I'm going to run a system check to be sure." What followed was a textbook example of troubleshooting under pressure. Sophia methodically worked through each aircraft system, checking circuit breakers, verifying switch positions, and monitoring parameters for any sign of deviation from normal. Her training had taught her to be systematic in her approach to problem solving, and that methodical mindset served her well now. Other pilots might have dismissed the intermittent warnings as minor glitches, but Sophia's careful nature demanded a thorough investigation. The hydraulic system was the first to show concrete signs of distress. The primary hydraulic pressure gauge, which should have indicated a steady 3,000 pounds per square inch, was fluctuating between normal readings and alarmingly low values. Sophia watched the needle dance across the instrument face with growing concern, recognizing that hydraulic pressure was essential for flight control operation, landing gear extension, and weapon systems function. "Control, Viper 2-1, Sophia transmitted, her voice calm despite the implications of what she was observing. "I'm showing unstable hydraulic pressure indications. Request immediate return to base for precautionary landing." The response from Captain Michaels was immediate and professional. "Roger, Viper 2-1. Turn left heading 270, maintain current altitude. Edwards Approach Control has been notified of your situation. Squawk emergency transponder code." As Sophia began her turn toward Edwards Air Force Base, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The hydraulic pressure gauge, which had been fluctuating for the past 5 minutes, suddenly dropped to 0 and stayed there. Simultaneously, her flight controls became noticeably heavier, requiring significantly more physical force to maintain straight and level flight. The F-16's fly-by-wire flight control system was designed to operate on backup electrical power in case of hydraulic failure, but the manual reversion mode transformed the responsive fighter into a muscle-powered challenge that tested every aspect of a pilot's physical and mental capabilities. Sophia's first instinct was to run through the emergency checklist for hydraulic system failure, a procedure she had memorized years earlier but hoped she would never need to use. The checklist was comprehensive but sobering. Loss of primary hydraulic pressure meant loss of normal flight control operation, loss of landing gear extension capability, loss of normal braking action, and loss of several other systems that pilots typically took for granted. The aircraft was still flyable, but landing it safely would require skills that pushed the boundaries of human capabilities. "Viper 2-1, this is Edward's approach," came a new voice on the radio. Senior Master Sergeant Patricia Wong, a controller with 20 years of experience talking pilots through emergencies. "We have you on radar, 23 miles southeast of the field. State your intentions." Sophia's response demonstrated the analytical thinking that had defined her approach to aviation throughout her career. Rather than immediately declaring an emergency and requesting priority handling, she took time to assess her options systematically. "Edward's approach, Viper 2-1. I've lost primary hydraulic pressure and I'm operating on manual reversion. I need to determine if my landing gear will extend before committing to an approach." This seemingly simple statement represented a complex decision-making process that other pilots might have rushed through. Sophia understood that attempting to land with inoperative landing gear was exponentially more dangerous than landing with gear that was merely difficult to extend. Before committing to an emergency approach, she needed to test every system and explore every option, even if doing so consumed precious fuel and time. The landing gear extension attempt was performed with characteristic thoroughness. Sophia followed the emergency procedures exactly, using the backup extension system that operated independently of the main hydraulic system. She could feel the aircraft shudder as the gear bay doors opened, and could sense the change in aerodynamic drag as the landing gear began to extend. For a brief moment, it seemed as though her systematic approach to problem-solving had identified a solution that would allow for a relatively normal landing.
Then came the sound that every pilot fears, a mechanical grinding noise, followed by an abrupt cessation of motion. The landing gear had extended partially, then jammed in a position that was neither fully up nor fully down. Sophia checked her landing gear position indicators, hoping for some sign that the gear might still be functional, but the lights showed only amber, the indication that the gear was in transit, neither properly stowed nor properly extended. "Edward's approach, Viper 2-1, Sophia transmitted, her voice carrying the first hint of the stress she was experiencing. "Landing gear will not extend fully. I'm showing unsafe gear indications across the board." The implications of this development were immediately understood by everyone monitoring the radio frequency. An aircraft with partially extended landing gear faced all the dangers of a belly landing: fire, structural damage, loss of control during ground roll, plus the additional hazard of asymmetric gear collapse, which could cause the aircraft to veer unpredictably or flip over during the landing attempt. Senior Master Sergeant Wong's response was measured and professional, but Sophia could detect the underlying concern in her voice. "Viper 2-1, understand unsafe gear indications. Are you able to recycle the landing gear system?" Sophia had already considered this option and rejected it based on her analysis of the situation. Attempting to retract and re-extend jammed landing gear risked causing additional damage to the system and potentially making her situation even worse. Her decision to leave the gear in its current position reflected the kind of conservative risk management that had characterized her entire flying career. "Negative, Edward's approach. The gear appears to be mechanically jammed. I'm going to maintain current configuration and evaluate my options." What followed was perhaps the most intense period of analysis and decision-making in Sophia's aviation career. Flying in large circles above the Mojave Desert, she systematically evaluated every possible course of action, considering the risks and benefits of each approach. She could attempt to land with the gear partially extended, hoping that the main landing gear would support the aircraft's weight despite their uncertain position. She could attempt to retract the gear and perform a belly landing, accepting the risks associated with landing without gear in exchange for a more predictable ground roll. Or she could continue flying until her fuel was exhausted, then attempt an emergency landing with whatever options remained available. Each option carried significant risks. Landing with partially extended gear could result in gear collapse and loss of control. Belly landing eliminated the risk of gear collapse, but introduced the dangers of structural damage, fire, and unpredictable aircraft behavior during the ground roll. Flying until fuel exhaustion would give her more time to analyze her situation, but would leave her with no options if she encountered additional complications during the approach. Sophia's decision-making process was interrupted by a new voice on the radio, Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the base commander, who had rushed to the control tower when informed of the emergency. "Sophia, this is Colonel Mitchell. We've got our best people working on your situation down here. What's your current fuel state?" The question forced Sophia to confront the time pressure she was facing. Her fuel gauge showed approximately 40 minutes of flight time remaining, enough to continue analyzing her situation, but not enough to delay indefinitely. She also had to consider the physical and mental fatigue that was beginning to affect her performance. Flying an aircraft on manual reversion required constant physical effort, and the stress of her emergency was taking a toll on her mental acuity. "Colonel, I've got about 35 minutes of fuel remaining. I'm currently evaluating my options for approach and landing." Colonel Mitchell's response demonstrated both her understanding of Sophia's ability and her awareness of the broader implications of the situation. "Sophia, we have complete confidence in your ability to handle this situation. Take whatever time you need to analyze your options. We're here to support you in any way we can." The vote of confidence meant more to Sophia than Colonel Mitchell could have known. For years, Sophia had sensed that her superiors viewed her careful approach to decision-making evidence of indecision or lack of confidence. To hear the base commander explicitly endorsing her methodical analysis of a complex emergency situation validated an approach to flying that Sophia had always believed was correct, but had rarely been acknowledged. As Sophia continued her analysis, ground personnel at Edwards Air Force Base were mobilizing resources for what was shaping up to be one of the most challenging emergency responses in the base's history. Fire trucks were positioning themselves along the runway, their crews checking equipment and reviewing procedures for aircraft fire suppression. Ambulances were standing by with medical personnel trained in treating crash injuries. The base hospital was notifying trauma specialists and preparing operating rooms for potential casualties. In the control tower, Senior Master Sergeant Wong was coordinating with multiple agencies to ensure that Sophia would have every possible resource available during her approach and landing. Military and civilian air traffic in a 50-mile radius was being diverted to other airports to clear the airspace around Edwards. Weather stations were providing minute-by-minute updates on wind conditions. Even the base fire chief was personally reviewing emergency response procedures, ensuring that his crews were prepared for any eventuality. Sophia was aware of this activity, but chose not to focus on it, understanding that dwelling on the consequences of failure would only interfere with her ability to find a solution. Instead, she concentrated on what she could control: her aircraft configuration, her approach path, and her technique during the landing attempt. This focus on controllable factors rather than external circumstances reflected the mental discipline that had always been one of her greatest strengths as a pilot. The decision, when it finally came, emerged from Sophia's systematic analysis of all available options. She would attempt to land with the gear in its current configuration,
betting that her careful approach technique could compensate for the uncertainty about gear integrity. It was a calculated risk, based on her assessment that this approach offered the best combination of controllability and structural protection. Edwards' approach, Viper 2-1, Sophia transmitted, her voice reflecting the calm determination that had characterized her entire approach to the emergency. I've completed my analysis. I'm going to attempt an approach and landing with gear in current configuration. Request emergency vehicles standing by and foam on the runway. The words hung in the air of the control tower, like a challenge thrown down before fate itself. Senior Master Sergeant Wong acknowledged the transmission with professional calm, but everyone present understood the magnitude of what Sophia had just committed to attempting. She was going to try to land a damaged fighter jet under conditions that existed nowhere in any training manual, using techniques that would have to be invented in real time. As Sophia began her approach to Edwards Air Force Base, the physical demands of flying the damaged aircraft became increasingly apparent. Without hydraulic assistance, every control input required significant muscular effort. Her arms were beginning to ache from the constant pressure required to maintain straight flight, and she could feel sweat building up inside her flight suit despite the cockpit's environmental control systems. The F-16 that had once responded to her touch like a well-trained horse now fought her like a wild animal, requiring constant attention and physical force to maintain even basic control. The approach itself became an exercise in applied physics that drew upon every aspect of Sophia's technical education. She had to calculate her descent rate manually, compensating for the increased drag created by her partially extended landing gear while maintaining enough airspeed to ensure adequate control authority. Too fast, and she risked overshooting the runway or landing so hard that her compromised gear would collapse immediately. Too slow, and she risked losing control entirely, with potentially catastrophic results. Sophia's approach was watched by dozens of people on the ground, each bringing their own expertise and perspective to bear on her situation. Colonel James Hartwell, the same officer who had questioned her psychological fitness just months earlier, stood in the tower watching through binoculars as her aircraft grew larger against the desert sky. For the first time since submitting that devastating performance review, Hartwell found himself questioning his assessment of Sophia's capabilities. The pilot he had described as emotionally fragile was demonstrating a level of composure under extreme stress that impressed even him. "She's holding a perfect glide path," observed Major Tom Rodriguez, the approach controller who had been talking Sophia through the emergency. "Look at that, steady as a rock, even with manual reversion."
Indeed, Sophia's approach was a testament to the power of thorough preparation and systematic thinking. While other pilots might have been overwhelmed by the complexity of her situation, Sophia had broken the problem down into manageable components and was executing each element with textbook precision. Her airspeed was exactly what it should be for her aircraft's current configuration. Her descent rate was optimal for the runway length available. Her track over the ground was perfectly aligned with the runway centerline. But textbook precision could only carry her so far. As Sophia descended through 1,000 feet above ground level, she began to encounter the atmospheric turbulence that builds up near the ground on warm desert afternoons. The gusting winds that were barely noticeable at altitude became significant control challenges at low altitude and slow airspeed. Each gust threatened to push her aircraft off its carefully calculated flight path, requiring immediate correction with controls that demanded increasing physical effort to operate. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The radio traffic during Sophia's final approach was minimal. Everyone understood that she needed to concentrate on flying and couldn't spare attention for lengthy conversations. But the few transmissions that did occur revealed the tension building in the control tower and among the emergency response teams positioned along the runway. Viper 2-1, wind now 280 at 12, gusting to 18.
Wong transmitted, providing Sophia with critical information about the changing wind conditions that could affect her landing. "Roger," Sophia replied briefly, her voice betraying none of the strain she was experiencing as she fought to maintain control of her aircraft in the turbulent air. At 500 feet above the ground, Sophia made a discovery that would have caused many pilots to abandon the approach and attempt to go around. Her aircraft's response to elevator inputs, the control movements that governed pitch attitude and descent rate, had become increasingly sluggish. What had been a controllable but difficult situation at altitude was becoming genuinely dangerous as she neared the ground. The manual reversion flight control system was approaching the limits of its effectiveness, and Sophia realized that she might only have one chance to get this landing right. The decision to continue the approach rather than attempt to go around reflected Sophia's understanding of her aircraft's capabilities and limitations. A go-around would require significant engine power and aggressive control inputs that might exceed her ability to maintain control. Better to continue with an approach that was working, even if it was more challenging than she had anticipated, than to attempt a maneuver that might prove impossible with her degraded flight controls. As Sophia descended through the final 100 feet above the runway, every person watching held their breath. The emergency vehicles that had been positioned along the runway were now clearly visible through her cockpit windows, their crews standing ready to respond to whatever happened in the next few seconds. Fire trucks with their foam systems prepared, ambulances with medical teams aboard, crash recovery vehicles with heavy lifting equipment, all waiting to see whether Sophia's careful planning and expert flying would be enough to overcome the mechanical failures that had turned a routine training flight into a life-or-death struggle. The landing itself unfolded in a sequence of events that would be analyzed frame by frame in the years that followed. Sophia's aircraft touched down on the runway centerline at exactly the airspeed she had calculated, her partially extended landing gear absorbing the initial impact better than anyone had dared to hope. For a brief moment, it seemed as though her systematic approach to problem-solving had indeed identified a workable solution to an impossible situation. Then physics and mechanical reality asserted themselves with brutal finality. The main landing gear, weakened by whatever malfunction had prevented their proper extension, began to collapse under the stress of supporting the aircraft's weight during the ground roll. Sophia felt the aircraft settle and heard the grinding sound of metal against concrete as her F-16 began to slide down the runway on its belly, no longer supported by landing gear, but not yet completely out of control. Managing an aircraft in an emergency situation, applying differential braking pressure, rudder inputs, and throttle adjustments in a desperate attempt to keep her fighter jet pointed straight down the runway rather than veering off into the desert. The sparks that erupted from the contact between aircraft structure and concrete runway created a spectacular light show that was visible for miles across the Mojave Desert. But Sophia's attention was focused entirely on the task of bringing her aircraft to a controlled stop. She could see the end of the runway approaching rapidly and knew that if she couldn't get stopped before reaching the overrun area, her emergency would transition from challenging to catastrophic. The friction between aircraft and runway was gradually bleeding off her airspeed, but not quickly enough to ensure that she would stop before running out of paved surface. Sophia made the decision to shut down her engine, eliminating the risk of fire while accepting that she would lose the small amount of directional control that engine thrust was providing. It was another calculated risk in a flight that had become a series of impossible choices, each one made with the systematic thinking that had defined her approach to aviation throughout her career. As her F-16 finally ground to a halt in a shower of sparks and a cloud of smoke from overheated metal, Sophia sat in her cockpit for a moment, scarcely believing that she was still alive. The silence that followed the cessation of motion was profound. No engine noise, no radio chatter, no grinding of metal against concrete. Just the quiet tick of cooling metal and the distant sound of emergency vehicles racing across the tarmac toward her position. The first responders reached Sophia's aircraft within seconds of her coming to a complete stop. Fire suppression foam covered her fighter jet in a thick white blanket, eliminating any risk of fire from fuel vapors or overheated components. Medical personnel were climbing ladders to reach her cockpit even before the foam had settled, ready to provide immediate treatment for any injuries she might have sustained during the violent landing. But Sophia emerged from her cockpit under her own power, moving with the careful precision that had characterized every aspect of her emergency. She had sustained no significant injuries beyond the muscle fatigue from wrestling with manual reversion flight controls for over an hour. More importantly, she had accomplished something that many experts had considered impossible, landing a severely damaged fighter jet safely despite multiple system failures and mechanical malfunctions that would have defeated less skilled and less prepared pilots. The immediate aftermath of Sophia's landing was controlled chaos. Medical personnel conducted thorough examinations to ensure she hadn't sustained internal injuries from the stress of the emergency landing. Accident investigation teams began the process of documenting every detail of the aircraft's condition and the sequence of events that had led to the emergency. Public affairs officers fielded calls from news organizations that had somehow learned about the dramatic rescue of a female fighter pilot at Edwards Air Force Base. But for Sophia, the most significant moment came when Colonel Hartwell appeared at her side in the medical facility where she was undergoing post-flight examination. The same officer who had questioned her emotional stability and recommended against her promotion stood before her with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal contrition. "Captain Chen," Hartwell said, his voice carrying a weight that transcended their formal rank relationship, "what you accomplished today was extraordinary. I owe you an apology for my previous assessment of your capabilities." Sophia's response was characteristically thoughtful and measured. "Sir, I was just doing my job. Everything I did today was based on training and preparation, not any special courage or skill." But Hartwell shook his head, rejecting her modest assessment of her own performance. "Captain, what you did today went far beyond training. You took a situation that should have been fatal and turned it into a successful outcome through superior airmanship and decision-making under extreme pressure. That's not something that can be taught in any school. It's something that comes from character." The conversation between Sophia and Colonel Hartwell represented more than a personal reconciliation between two officers. It symbolized a broader recognition that the qualities Sophia had always brought to her flying, careful preparation, systematic analysis, conservative risk management, were not signs of weakness but sources of extraordinary strength. Her emergency landing had demonstrated that true courage often manifested not as aggressive bravado, but as quiet competence applied under pressure. The technical investigation that followed Sophia's emergency landing revealed the full extent of the mechanical failures she had overcome. A catastrophic hydraulic system malfunction had been caused by a microscopic crack in a fitting that had gone undetected during routine inspections. The landing gear malfunction was the result of a secondary failure in the gear extension mechanism that occurred when the system attempted to operate without adequate hydraulic pressure. Either failure alone would have created a significant emergency. The combination of both failures simultaneously created a situation that should have been unsurvivable. Yet Sophia had not merely survived, she had executed a landing that aviation experts would study for decades as an example of superior airmanship under impossible conditions. The video footage of her approach and landing, captured by base security cameras, became required viewing in flight schools around the world. Student pilots watched frame by frame as Sophia demonstrated how systematic thinking and careful execution could overcome mechanical failures that defeated the aircraft's designer's best efforts. The ripple effects of Sophia's emergency landing extended far beyond Edwards Air Force Base. Her story became a case study in crisis management used in business schools to illustrate how methodical analysis and conservative decision-making could produce superior outcomes even under extreme pressure. Medical schools incorporated her experience into their curriculum as an example of how surgical thinking, careful, systematic, and focused on controllable factors, could be applied successfully in non-medical emergency situations. But perhaps the most significant impact was on military aviation culture itself. Sophia's success challenged long-held assumptions about the relationship between aggressive confidence and piloting skill. Her quiet competence and methodical approach, previously viewed as limitations, were now recognized as assets that had enabled her to accomplish what more traditionally aggressive pilots might not have achieved. The transformation in how Sophia was perceived by her peers was immediate and dramatic. Pilots who had previously dismissed her as overly cautious now sought her advice on complex problems.
Her call sign evolved from whisper, a designation that carried implications of weakness, to bamboo, reflecting her grandmother's wisdom about strength that bends but never breaks. The new call sign was suggested by Colonel Mitchell herself, who recognized that Sophia's flexibility and resilience represented qualities that the Air Force needed to cultivate in all its pilots. Sophia's emergency landing had demonstrated that heroism often looks different than popular culture suggests. It doesn't always involve dramatic gestures or spectacular displays of courage. Sometimes it manifests as quiet competence, systematic thinking, and the refusal to panic when everything goes wrong. Sophia had shown that the pilot deemed too fragile for combat was actually strong enough to accomplish the impossible. That her supposed emotional instability was actually unshakable calm under pressure, and that her methodical approach to problem-solving was exactly what was needed when conventional solutions failed. The transformation in how Sophia was perceived by her peers began within hours of her emergency landing, but the full scope of what she had accomplished only became clear as investigators pieced together the sequence of failures that should have made survival impossible. Senior Master Sergeant Patricia Wong, who had talked Sophia through her approach, was the first to articulate what everyone in the aviation community was beginning to understand. What Captain Chen did today wasn't just good flying, it was a complete reinvention of how we think about emergency response under pressure. The technical analysis conducted by the Air Force Safety Center revealed failures in multiple redundant systems that aircraft designers had assumed could never fail simultaneously. The primary hydraulic system had suffered what investigators termed catastrophic decompression due to a hairline fracture in a titanium fitting that had developed over thousands of flight hours. This type of failure was so rare that it occurred perhaps once in every million flight hours, making it a statistical anomaly that most pilots would never encounter in an entire career. The landing gear malfunction was even more extraordinary. When the primary hydraulic system failed, Sophia had followed proper procedures by attempting to extend the gear using the emergency backup system. But the investigation revealed that the backup system had also been compromised by a completely unrelated electrical fault that had developed just hours before her flight. The probability of both failures occurring on the same sortie was so small it approached mathematical impossibility. Yet, it had happened to Sophia, and she had survived it. Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Martinez, the chief accident investigator, presented her findings to a packed auditorium at Edwards Air Force Base 3 weeks after Sophia's emergency landing. The audience included not only military personnel but also representatives from aircraft manufacturers, civilian aviation authorities, and engineering schools who had come to understand how Sophia had accomplished what their computer models suggested was impossible. Captain Chen faced a scenario that our simulators cannot replicate because we never programmed them to fail in so many ways simultaneously, Martinez explained, using a laser pointer to highlight the complex sequence of mechanical failures displayed on her presentation screen. Every decision she made during her emergency was technically correct, but more than that, her decisions were optimal. She chose the best possible option at every critical juncture, despite having no training for this specific combination of failures. The revelation that Sophia had been operating outside the boundaries of any existing emergency procedures elevated her accomplishment from impressive to historic. She hadn't simply followed her training to overcome a challenging situation. She had improvised new techniques in real time, inventing solutions to problems that had never been anticipated by aircraft designers or training specialists. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the base commander, found herself fielding calls from senior Air Force leadership who wanted to understand how a pilot who had been recommended against for promotion had managed to accomplish something that veteran test pilots with decades of experience might not have survived. The questions forced Mitchell to confront uncomfortable truths about how the military evaluated pilot performance and potential. "We've been measuring the wrong things," Mitchell confided to her deputy commander, Colonel David Park, during a private meeting in her office. We've been looking for pilots who project confidence and make quick decisions, but Sophia's success came from exactly the opposite approach. She took time to analyze her situation, considered multiple options, and chose the safest course of action rather than the most dramatic one. The realization that Sophia's methodical approach had been a strength rather than a weakness began to ripple through the broader Air Force community. Flight training programs started incorporating case studies of her emergency, using her decision-making process as an example of optimal pilot judgment under pressure. The careful, systematic approach that had once been dismissed as overly cautious was now being taught as a model of superior airmanship. Sophia herself was struggling to process the sudden shift in how she was perceived. For years, she had internalized the message that her quiet competence was insufficient, that she lacked the aggressive instincts necessary for military aviation success. Now she was being told that her greatest perceived weakness had actually been her greatest strength all along. The phone call from her parents came 2 days after her emergency landing, after news of her accomplishment had appeared in newspapers across the country. Dr. David Chen's voice carried a mixture of pride and relief that his daughter could hear clearly despite the thousands of miles between them. "Sophia," her father said, his normally controlled voice thick with emotion, "your mother and I saw the news reports. We always knew you were strong, but what you did, it reminds me of your grandmother's stories about surviving the war. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who appear most gentle." The comparison to her grandmother Eleanor struck Sophia deeply. Throughout her childhood, she had heard stories about Eleanor's survival during the Japanese occupation of Taiwan, how she had protected her family through careful planning and quiet resistance rather than dramatic confrontation. She had always admired those stories but had never seen the connection to her own approach to challenges. Now, in the wake of her emergency landing, the parallel seemed obvious. The formal recognition of Sophia's accomplishment came in the form of awards and commendations that accumulated with surprising speed. The Distinguished Flying Cross, awarded for heroism in aerial flight, was announced just 2 weeks after her emergency landing. The Air Force Commendation Medal for exceptional service followed a week later. But the recognition that meant the most to Sophia came from an unexpected source: a letter from the widow of a test pilot who had been killed in a similar emergency 5 years earlier. "Dear Captain Chen," the letter began, "my husband faced a situation very similar to yours in 2019. He was an exceptional pilot with 30 years of experience, but he didn't survive his emergency landing. Reading about your success has helped me understand that sometimes survival isn't about experience or strength, it's about making the right decisions at the right time. Thank you for showing that it's possible to overcome the impossible." The letter forced Sophia to confront the random nature of survival in military aviation. She had succeeded where others had failed, not because she was necessarily more skilled, but because she had approached her emergency with a mindset that prioritized careful analysis over quick action. It was a sobering reminder that her success carried responsibilities, to honor those who hadn't been as fortunate and to share what she had learned with other pilots who might face similar challenges. The media attention surrounding Sophia's story created opportunities she had never anticipated. Aviation magazines requested interviews about her decision-making process during the emergency. Universities invited her to speak about crisis management and systematic problem-solving. Even civilian publications showed interest in her story as an example of how quiet competence could triumph over seemingly impossible odds. Sophia's first public speaking engagement was at the Air Force Academy, where she addressed a gathering of cadet pilots who were just beginning their aviation careers. Standing at the podium in the Academy's modern auditorium, looking out at hundreds of young faces eager to hear her story, Sophia felt the weight of responsibility that came with being held up as an example of exceptional airmanship. "When I was sitting in my cockpit above Edwards Air Force Base, trying to figure out how to land a jet with no hydraulics and jammed landing gear, I wasn't thinking about being heroic. I was thinking about all the procedures I had memorized, all the scenarios I had practiced, all the lessons my instructors had taught me about breaking complex problems into manageable pieces.
The speech was well received, but what resonated most with the cadets were Sophia's comments about the value of preparation and systematic thinking. She described how her habit of conducting thorough pre-flight inspections had given her intimate knowledge of her aircraft systems. She explained how her practice of mentally rehearsing emergency procedures had prepared her to remain calm when those procedures became necessary. Most importantly, she emphasized that her success had come from disciplined preparation and methodical execution. The questions from the cadets revealed how profoundly Sophia's story had challenged their assumptions about military aviation. One cadet asked whether she had ever doubted her decision to continue flying rather than eject from her damaged aircraft. Another wanted to know how she had maintained her composure when facing what seemed like certain death. Sophia's answers were characteristically thoughtful and honest. She admitted to moments of fear during her emergency, but she explained that her training had taught her to acknowledge those fears without being paralyzed by them. She described how her decision to continue flying had been based on careful analysis of her options rather than reckless bravery. Most importantly, she emphasized that her success had been built on a foundation of preparation that began long before she ever climbed into the cockpit of a damaged aircraft. The ripple effects of Sophia's emergency landing extended beyond the military aviation community. Harvard Business School developed a case study based on her decision-making process, using her systematic approach to problem-solving as an example of effective leadership under extreme pressure. Medical schools incorporated her story into their training programs, drawing parallels between her methodical analysis of aircraft systems and the diagnostic processes used by emergency room physicians. Even NASA showed interest in Sophia's experience, recognizing that space missions often required the same kind of systematic problem-solving that had enabled her to survive her emergency. Agency officials reached out to discuss how her techniques might be applied to spacecraft emergencies, where crews would need to diagnose and solve complex problems while operating far from any possibility of immediate rescue. The academic interest in Sophia's story validated her belief that flying was fundamentally an intellectual exercise, a form of applied science that required systematic thinking and careful execution. For years, she had felt out of place in a culture that valued aggressive instincts over analytical thinking. Now she was being recognized as an example of how intellectual approaches to problem-solving could produce superior results, even in high-stress, life-threatening situations. The transformation in Sophia's standing within her own squadron was perhaps the most personally meaningful aspect of her newfound recognition. Pilots who had previously questioned her commitment to military aviation now sought her advice on complex problems. Her methodical approach to flight planning, once viewed as excessive, was now studied and emulated by colleagues who recognized its value. Captain Jake Morrison, the instructor pilot who had originally assigned Sophia her "Whisper" call sign, approached her one day in the squadron briefing room with what amounted to a public apology. "Sophia," he said, his voice carrying genuine contrition, "I owe you an acknowledgement. When I called you Whisper all those years ago, I thought I was pointing out a weakness. I was wrong. Your quiet competence is exactly what this profession needs more of." Morrison's comment reflected a broader shift in military aviation culture that was being driven by Sophia's example. The traditional emphasis on aggressive confidence and quick decision-making was being balanced by a new appreciation for careful analysis and systematic problem-solving. Flight training programs began incorporating her techniques, teaching student pilots to approach emergencies with the same methodical mindset that had enabled Sophia to survive the impossible. Colonel James Hartwell's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic of all. The officer who questioned Sophia's emotional stability and recommended against her promotion became one of her strongest advocates, using her example to challenge his own assumptions about pilot selection and evaluation. In a memo that circulated throughout Air Force personnel offices, Hartwell wrote, "Captain Chen's emergency landing demonstrates that we must reconsider how we assess pilot potential. The qualities we have traditionally valued, aggressive confidence, and quick decision-making are important, but they must be balanced with careful analysis and systematic thinking. Captain Chen's success proves that quiet competence can be just as valuable as dramatic leadership. The formal investigation into Sophia's emergency landing produced recommendations that would influence Air Force training and procedures for years to come. Investigators recommended changes to pre-flight inspection procedures, modifications to emergency checklists, and new training scenarios based on the combination of failures Sophia had overcome. But perhaps the most important recommendation was cultural, a call for the Air Force to recognize and value different approaches to pilot decision-making, including the methodical analysis that had enabled Sophia to survive. The personal cost of Sophia's sudden fame was something she struggled to process. Overnight, she had gone from being a quiet, overlooked pilot to being held up as an example of exceptional airmanship. The attention was gratifying, but also overwhelming, especially for someone who had always preferred to let her work speak for itself rather than seeking public recognition. Sophia's relationship with her own accomplishment was complex. She was proud of what she had achieved, but uncomfortable with being treated as a hero for what she saw as simply doing her job well. She understood that her success carried symbolic weight, as a woman in a male-dominated profession, as an example of how different leadership styles could be equally effective, but she worried about being reduced to a symbol rather than being recognized as a complete person. The conversation that helped Sophia process her feelings about her newfound recognition came from an unexpected source. Colonel Patricia Rodriguez, the pilot whose speech had originally inspired Sophia to pursue military aviation. Rodriguez visited Edwards Air Force Base specifically to meet with Sophia, bringing with her the perspective of someone who had faced similar challenges as a pioneering woman in fighter aviation. "Sophia," Rodriguez said during their private meeting in the squadron conference room, "I know the attention feels overwhelming right now. When I was the first woman to fly combat missions in the F-16, I felt like I was carrying the weight of every woman who might follow me. But here's what I learned. Your success isn't just about you. It's about expanding everyone's understanding of what effective leadership looks like." Rodriguez's words helped Sophia understand that her emergency landing had accomplished something beyond mere survival. She had demonstrated that excellence in aviation could take many forms, that the quiet competence she always brought to her flying was not only valid but potentially superior to more traditional approaches. Her success had opened doors for other pilots who didn't fit the conventional mold of military aviation, proving that systematic thinking and careful preparation could triumph over the most extreme challenges. The culmination of Sophia's recognition came 6 months after her emergency landing, when she was selected to receive the McKay Trophy, awarded annually to the Air Force person or unit making the most significant contribution to flight safety. The award ceremony, held at the Pentagon with senior military leaders and aviation dignitaries in attendance, represented the highest level of professional recognition available to a military pilot. Standing at the podium in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, surrounded by portraits of Medal of Honor recipients and displays commemorating the greatest achievements in military history, Sophia felt the full weight of how far she had traveled from that morning when she had conducted her routine pre-flight inspection of a jet she thought would carry her through a simple training mission. 6 months ago, Sophia told the distinguished audience, "I was just a pilot doing my job. I had no idea that my training and preparation were preparing me for a test that would define not only my career, but my understanding of what it means to serve." What I learned that day above Edwards Air Force Base is that heroism often looks different than we expect. Sometimes it's not about dramatic gestures or exceptional courage. Sometimes it's about careful preparation, systematic thinking, and the refusal to give up when everything goes wrong. The standing ovation that followed Sophia's acceptance speech lasted for several minutes, but what she remembered most was the expression on Colonel Hartwell's face as he applauded.
The officer who had once questioned her fitness for military aviation was now leading the recognition of her as one of the Air Force's most accomplished pilots. It was a transformation that symbolized not just personal redemption, but institutional growth. The military's evolving understanding of how different types of strength could serve the same noble purposes. 2 years after her emergency landing, Sophia stood in the same briefing room at Edwards Air Force Base where she had once endured skeptical questions about her flying abilities. But now she occupied a very different role. As the newly appointed Chief of Flight Safety, she was responsible for developing training programs that would teach other pilots the systematic decision-making techniques that had saved her life and revolutionized military aviation's approach to emergency management. The transformation of Sophia's career trajectory had been swift and decisive. Within 6 months of her emergency landing, she had been promoted to major and selected for a master's degree program in aerospace engineering at the Air Force Institute of Technology. Her thesis research focused on human factors in aviation emergency response, using her own experience as a foundation for developing new training methodologies that emphasized analytical thinking over instinctive reaction. The program Sophia developed, officially titled Systematic Emergency Response Training, but known throughout the Air Force as Bamboo Protocol, had become mandatory for all pilots at every experience level. The name reflected her new call sign and embodied the core philosophy she brought to aviation safety, the idea that flexibility and careful analysis could overcome seemingly impossible challenges. The traditional approach to emergency training has focused on memorizing procedures and practicing quick responses, but real emergencies rarely follow the scenarios we've practiced. What pilots need is not just knowledge of procedures, but the ability to analyze complex problems systematically and adapt their responses to unique circumstances. The Bamboo Protocol represented a fundamental shift in how the military approached pilot training. Instead of emphasizing speed and aggressiveness, the new methodology taught pilots to approach emergencies with the same careful analysis that Sophia had employed during her own crisis. Students learned to break complex problems into manageable components, to consider multiple solutions before committing to a course of action, and to maintain emotional control even when facing life-threatening situations. The results of Sophia's training program exceeded everyone's expectations. Flight safety statistics improved dramatically as pilots trained in the Bamboo Protocol demonstrated superior performance in both simulated and actual emergencies. The number of successfully resolved in-flight emergencies increased by 37% in the first year after the program's implementation, while the rate of emergency-related fatalities dropped to the lowest level in Air Force history. Sophia's influence extended far beyond her own service branch. The Navy and Marine Corps adopted modified versions of her training protocol for their own aviation programs. NASA incorporated her decision-making frameworks into astronaut training, recognizing that space missions often required the same systematic problem-solving that had enabled her to survive her emergency. Even civilian aviation authorities began studying her techniques, developing new approaches to commercial pilot training based on her methodologies. The international recognition of Sophia's contributions came in the form of speaking engagements and consulting opportunities that took her around the world. Aviation authorities in Europe, Asia, and Australia invited her to share her experience and help develop improved training programs for their own pilots. Each presentation reinforced the same core message, that effective emergency response required not just technical skill, but a systematic approach to problem-solving that could be taught and learned. During a presentation to the International Civil Aviation Organization in Montreal, Sophia addressed an audience that included aviation officials from 53 countries. The diversity of the audience reflected the universal applicability of the principles she had discovered during her emergency. Systematic thinking, careful analysis, and methodical execution were valuable regardless of the type of aircraft, the nature of the emergency, or the cultural background of the pilot. What I learned during my emergency landing, Sophia told the international audience, is that the human mind is capable of extraordinary performance under pressure, but only if we train it properly. The traditional emphasis on quick decision-making serves us well in many situations, but in complex emergencies, careful analysis produces better outcomes than rapid reaction. The personal transformation Sophia experienced was perhaps even more profound than her professional evolution. The quiet, self-doubting pilot who had once wondered whether she belonged in military aviation had become a confident leader whose expertise was sought by aviation professionals around the world. But success hadn't changed her fundamental approach to challenges. She remained methodical, careful, and focused on preparation rather than dramatic gestures. Sophia's relationship with her family had also evolved in meaningful ways. Her parents, who had initially struggled to understand her choice of career, now took pride in her accomplishments and the positive impact she was having on aviation safety. Dr. David Chen, in particular, found parallels between his daughter's approach to aviation emergencies and his own methodology in surgical practice. When I first heard about Sophia's emergency landing, Dr. Chen told a gathering of medical colleagues during a presentation about crisis management in healthcare, I was terrified for her safety. But as I learned more about how she handled the situation, I realized that she had applied the same systematic thinking I try to teach young surgeons. The principles of careful diagnosis, methodical planning, and precise execution apply whether you're operating on a patient or landing a damaged aircraft. The influence of Sophia's grandmother Eleanor remained a constant source of strength and perspective. Though Eleanor had died before witnessing her granddaughter's triumph, her wisdom about bamboo bending but never breaking had proven prophetic. Sophia kept a small bamboo plant in her office, a reminder of the strength that comes from flexibility rather than rigidity. The ripple effects of Sophia's emergency landing continued to spread throughout the aviation community. Young pilots, particularly women, found inspiration in her story and began approaching their own careers with greater confidence. The idea that quiet competence could be just as valuable as aggressive leadership opened doors for aviators who might not have fit the traditional military pilot stereotype. Lieutenant Sarah Kim, one of Sophia's former students who had gone on to become a test pilot at Edwards, credited Sophia's mentorship with helping her navigate her own career challenges. Major Chen showed me that I didn't have to change who I was to be successful as a pilot, explained during an interview for an aviation magazine. She proved that systematic thinking and careful preparation weren't signs of weakness. They were sources of strength that could overcome any challenge. The transformation of military aviation culture that Sophia's success had initiated continued to accelerate. Flight training programs increasingly emphasized analytical thinking alongside traditional piloting skills. Selection criteria for pilot training began to value diverse approaches to problem-solving rather than focusing exclusively on aggressive confidence. The result was a generation of pilots who were not only technically proficient, but also intellectually equipped to handle the complex challenges of modern aviation. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, who had supported Sophia throughout her crisis and subsequent rise to prominence, reflected on the broader implications of her subordinate's success during a presentation to senior Air Force leaders. Captain, now Major, Chen's emergency landing taught us that we had been measuring pilot potential incorrectly, Mitchell explained. We had confused leadership with loudness, competence with aggression, and strength with inflexibility. Sophia showed us that true airmanship comes from careful preparation, systematic thinking, and the humility to acknowledge when you don't know something. The institutional changes inspired by Sophia's example extended beyond aviation training to broader questions of leadership development and performance evaluation. The Air Force began experimenting with assessment methods that valued analytical thinking and systematic problem-solving alongside traditional measures of pilot aptitude.
The result was a more diverse and intellectually capable officer corps that was better equipped to handle the complex challenges of 21st-century military operations. Sophia's own career continued to flourish as she took on increasingly challenging assignments that leveraged her expertise in crisis management and systematic problem-solving. She was selected for early promotion to lieutenant colonel and assigned to the Pentagon as an advisor on aviation safety policy. The position allowed her to influence Air Force-wide practices and to ensure that the lessons learned from her emergency landing were incorporated into institutional policies and procedures. The research Sophia conducted during her graduate studies had produced insights that extended far beyond aviation applications. Her analysis of decision-making under extreme stress had implications for medical practice, business management, and emergency response operations. Universities began incorporating her work into courses on crisis leadership, using her emergency landing as a case study in effective decision-making under pressure. The documentary film about Sophia's emergency landing, produced 3 years after the incident, brought her story to an even wider audience. Bamboo, the Sophia story, won several awards for its portrayal of courage under pressure and became required viewing in leadership development programs across multiple industries. The film's success reflected the universal appeal of Sophia's message that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things through careful preparation and systematic thinking. The most meaningful recognition of Sophia's impact came from an unexpected source: the families of pilots whose lives had been saved by the training programs she had developed. Letters arrived regularly at her Pentagon office, each one telling the story of an aviator who had successfully handled an emergency using techniques learned through the Bamboo Protocol. These personal testimonials meant more to Sophia than any formal award or official recognition. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. One letter from the wife of an Air National Guard pilot who had successfully landed an F-16 using Sophia's methodologies particularly moved her. Major Chen, my husband came home safely last month because of techniques he learned in your training program. When his aircraft lost hydraulic pressure over the Nevada desert, he didn't panic. He systematically worked through the problem just like you taught him. I wanted you to know that your emergency landing didn't just save your own life, it's been saving lives ever since. Sophia's approach to command responsibilities reflected the same systematic thinking that had characterized her flying. As Chief of Flight Safety, she instituted regular review sessions where pilots could discuss near-miss incidents without fear of punishment, creating an environment where learning from mistakes was more important than avoiding blame. The program, known as Bamboo Sessions in honor of her call sign, revolutionized how the Air Force approached safety reporting and incident analysis.
The goal isn't to identify who made a mistake, Sophia explained during one of these sessions, addressing a room full of pilots who had initially been skeptical about openly discussing their errors. The goal is to understand why the mistake happened and how we can prevent similar incidents in the future. Every near miss is a learning opportunity that could save lives down the road. The success of Sophia's safety programs led to her selection for attendance at the Air War College, the Air Force's premier professional military education institution. Her thesis project focused on the integration of systematic decision-making processes into all aspects of military operations, extending the principles he had discovered during her emergency landing to broader questions of military leadership and strategic planning. During her time at the War College, Sophia had the opportunity to interact with senior officers from all branches of the military, sharing her insights about crisis management and systematic problem-solving with leaders who would go on to command major military operations. The respect she earned from these experienced officers validated her belief that the principles she had discovered were applicable far beyond aviation emergencies. Colonel Patricia Rodriguez, the pilot whose speech had originally inspired Sophia to pursue military aviation,
visited the War College during Sophia's time there to deliver a guest lecture. After her presentation, Rodriguez sought out Sophia for a private conversation that proved to be deeply meaningful for both officers. "Sophia," Rodriguez said as they walked across the college campus, "when I spoke to you and your classmates all those years ago, I was trying to convince young people that flying fighters was about precision and intellectual challenge, not just adventure and glory. I never imagined that one of my listeners would go on to prove that point so dramatically. You've become everything I hoped military aviation could produce, a pilot whose technical excellence is matched by intellectual rigor and moral courage." The conversation with Rodriguez helped Sophia understand the broader significance of her journey from questioned pilot to respected leader. She had not only overcome personal challenges and professional skepticism, she had helped transform an entire culture, proving that diverse approaches to leadership and problem-solving could produce superior results even in the most demanding circumstances. Sophia's influence on the next generation of pilots became apparent during her frequent visits to the Air Force Academy, where she served as a guest instructor and mentor. Cadets who had grown up hearing about her emergency landing approached aviation training with a different mindset than previous generations, understanding that systematic thinking and careful preparation were just as important as flying skills and aggressive confidence. Cadet Jennifer Martinez, a first-generation American whose parents had immigrated from Mexico, credited Sophia's example with giving her the confidence to pursue military aviation despite not fitting the traditional pilot stereotype. "Major Chen showed me that I didn't have to be loud or aggressive to be a good pilot," Martinez explained during a mentoring session. Her success proved that careful thinking and thorough preparation could be just as valuable as natural talent or aggressive instincts. The institutional changes Sophia had inspired continued to evolve and expand. The Air Force Academy modified its curriculum to include courses on systematic decision-making and crisis management, using Sophia's emergency landing as a primary case study. Flight training programs at every level incorporated scenarios based on her experience, teaching student pilots to approach complex problems with the same methodical analysis that had enabled her to survive. The international impact of Sophia's work became evident during a NATO symposium on aviation safety, where representatives from 29 countries gathered to discuss best practices in pilot training and emergency response. Sophia's presentation on systematic decision-making under pressure was received as a breakthrough in understanding how to prepare aviators for the complex challenges of modern warfare and peacekeeping operations. The principles Major Chen has developed are applicable regardless of the type of aircraft, the nature of the emergency, or the cultural background of the pilot, observed Group Captain Elizabeth Thornton of the Royal Air Force. Her methodologies represent a fundamental advance in our understanding of how to train pilots to handle extreme situations with competence and confidence.
Sophia's personal relationship with flying had also evolved in profound ways. The activity that had once been a source of anxiety and self-doubt had become a form of meditation, a way of connecting with principles of physics and engineering that brought her deep satisfaction. She approached each flight with the same careful preparation that had always characterized her flying, but now that preparation was informed by confidence rather than fear. During a routine training flight, 5 years after her emergency landing, Sophia found herself flying the same type of aircraft over the same desert where she had once faced what seemed like certain death. But instead of dwelling on the trauma of that experience, she used the flight as an opportunity to reflect on how much she had learned and grown. The quiet pilot who had once questioned her place in military aviation had become a leader whose expertise was sought by aviators around the world. The legacy Sophia was building extended beyond her own accomplishments to the broader question of how institutions could recognize and develop different types of talent. Her success had challenged long-held assumptions about leadership and performance, proving that systematic thinkers could be just as effective as instinctive decision-makers in high-pressure situations.
A study conducted by the Rand Corporation 5 years after Sophia's emergency landing quantified the impact of her training methodologies on aviation safety. The research showed that pilots trained in systematic decision-making techniques were 35% more likely to successfully resolve in-flight emergencies and 42% less likely to make critical errors during high-stress situations. The study's conclusions validated Sophia's belief that intellectual approaches to problem-solving could produce measurably superior results in demanding operational environments. Sophia's approach to leadership development influenced practices far beyond military aviation. Business schools began incorporating her decision-making frameworks into courses on crisis management and organizational leadership. Medical schools used her emergency landing as a case study in maintaining composure under extreme pressure. Even law enforcement agencies adopted modified versions of her training protocols for high-stress tactical situations. The transformation of Sophia's own squadron at Edwards Air Force Base reflected the broader cultural changes her success had initiated. The unit that had once questioned her fitness for military aviation had become a model for systematic approaches to flight operations and emergency preparedness. Young pilots competed for assignments to Sophia's former squadron, knowing that they would receive training in the most advanced decision-making techniques available in military aviation. Staff Sergeant Lisa Williams, Sophia's former crew chief who had witnessed her emergency landing firsthand, was promoted to Master Sergeant and assigned to lead the maintenance training program that prepared ground crews to support the Bamboo Protocol. Williams' experience working with Sophia had taught her that attention to detail and systematic thinking were just as important for maintenance personnel as they were for pilots. Major Chen taught me that there's no such thing as a routine flight or a routine maintenance action, Williams explained to a group of young airmen during a training session. Every inspection, every repair, every system check could be the difference between a successful mission and a tragedy. The same systematic thinking that enabled her to survive her emergency can help us prevent emergencies from happening in the first place. The recognition Sophia received from civilian aviation authorities validated the universal applicability of her principles. The Federal Aviation Administration invited her to serve on a committee developing new training requirements for commercial pilots, recognizing that her insights about systematic decision-making could benefit airline operations just as much as military flying. Sophia's influence on aviation safety extended to international civilian aviation as well. The European Aviation Safety Agency incorporated her training methodologies into their pilot certification requirements, while aviation authorities in Asia and Australia developed their own versions of the Bamboo Protocol for commercial and military applications. The personal cost of Sophia's success, the constant travel, speaking engagements, and professional obligations, was balanced by the deep satisfaction she derived from knowing that her experience was helping other aviators survive situations that might otherwise prove fatal. Each successful emergency landing, each pilot who applied her techniques to overcome a crisis, each life saved through systematic thinking and careful preparation, justified the sacrifices she had made to share her knowledge with the aviation community. As Sophia prepared for her next assignment, command of a flying training squadron where she would have direct responsibility for developing the next generation of military pilots, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a questioned aviator to a respected leader. The emergency landing that had once seemed like the end of her career had actually been the beginning of a new chapter, one defined not by survival, but by service to others facing their own impossible challenges. 3 years later, Lieutenant Colonel Sophia stood at the podium of the International Test Pilot School, addressing a gathering that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. Before her sat the most elite aviators from 12 different countries, test pilots whose job it was to push aircraft to their absolute limits and beyond. These were the pilots who flew experimental aircraft, who tested new technologies, who routinely placed themselves in situations where the margin between success and catastrophe was measured in milliseconds and millimeters. When I first walked into a squadron briefing room 15 years ago, Sophia began, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had become her trademark. I was told that I didn't have the aggressive instincts necessary for military aviation. Today, systematic decision-making, the approach I was once criticized for, is taught in flight schools on 6 continents. The change didn't happen because I convinced anyone I was right. It happened because results convinced everyone that different approaches to the same challenges could produce superior outcomes. The audience included pilots who had used Sophia's methodologies to survive their own emergencies, engineers who had incorporated her decision-making frameworks into aircraft design processes, and commanders who had implemented the Bamboo Protocol throughout their organizations. Her influence had spread far beyond the small community of fighter pilots where it had originated, becoming a standard reference point for anyone who faced high-stakes decisions under extreme pressure. In the 5 years since her emergency landing, Sophia had commanded a training squadron, earned a doctorate in aerospace engineering, and been selected for promotion to full colonel, a rank that placed her among the senior leadership of the United States Air Force. But more importantly, she had fundamentally altered how military aviation approached pilot development and emergency response. The Bamboo Protocol had evolved into a comprehensive system of training and evaluation that was now mandatory throughout the Air Force and had been adopted in modified forms by military services around the world. What had begun as one pilot's systematic approach to an impossible emergency had become an institutional philosophy that emphasized careful analysis, thorough preparation, and methodical execution in all aspects of aviation operations. 5 years later, Colonel Sophia paused in her review of budget documents to look out the window of her Pentagon office, watching the steady stream of aircraft approaching and departing from Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. As the newly appointed Director of Air Force Flight Safety, she was responsible for policies and programs that affected every pilot in the service, from student aviators taking their first solo flights to seasoned commanders leading complex combat operations. The statistical evidence of her impact was overwhelming. Since the implementation of systematic decision-making training, the Air Force has experienced its safest period in history. In-flight emergency survival rates had improved by 47%, while the number of preventable accidents had dropped to less than half their previous levels. But Sophia was most proud of the cultural transformation that had accompanied these improvements. The creation of an environment where careful thinking was valued as highly as quick reactions, where thorough preparation was seen as a sign of professionalism rather than weakness. Her office walls displayed awards and commendations from aviation organizations around the world, but the items Sophia treasured most were personal letters from pilots whose lives had been saved by techniques they learned through her training programs. A British Royal Air Force pilot who had successfully handled a catastrophic engine failure over the North Sea. An Australian pilot who had managed to land a damaged helicopter after a mechanical failure during a rescue mission. A Japanese self-defense force aviator who had prevented a mid-air collision through systematic analysis of a complex air traffic situation. Each letter represented not just a life saved, but a validation of the principle that had guided Sophia throughout her career, that intellectual rigor and systematic thinking could overcome challenges that seemed impossible to surmount through conventional approaches. The quiet, methodical pilot who had once been dismissed as too fragile for military aviation had become one of the most influential figures in aviation safety worldwide. The knock on her office door interrupted Sophia's reflection. Her aide, Captain Rebecca Torres, entered with a folder containing the day's most urgent correspondence. Among the routine administrative documents was a letter that made Sophia smile, a handwritten note from a young cadet at the Air Force Academy who had just completed her first solo flight. Colonel Chen, the letter read, I wanted you to know that I successfully completed my solo flight yesterday using the systematic approach you taught us during your visit to the Academy. When I encountered unexpected turbulence, I didn't panic. I methodically worked through my options and made the adjustments necessary to maintain safe flight. My instructor said my composure under pressure reminded him of someone he knew. Thank you for showing me that careful thinking isn't a weakness, it's a superpower. The letter was signed by Cadet Jennifer Martinez, the young woman Sophia had mentored several years earlier. Martinez was now approaching graduation and had been selected for fighter pilot training, following in the footsteps of the woman who had shown her that systematic thinking and thorough preparation could be just as valuable as natural flying ability or aggressive confidence. 10 years later, Brigadier General Sophia Chen stood on the reviewing platform at the Air Force Academy, watching as the newest class of commissioned officers took their oath of service. Among the graduating cadets was now Second Lieutenant Jennifer Martinez, who had indeed completed fighter pilot training and was scheduled to begin flying F-22 Raptors, the Air Force's most advanced fighter aircraft. Sophia's promotion to general officer rank had come with assignment as Commandant of the Air Force Test Pilot School, a position that placed her at the center of military aviation's most cutting-edge developments. Test pilots trained under her leadership were not only pushing the boundaries of aircraft performance, but also pioneering new approaches to human-machine integration that incorporated systematic decision-making principles into the design of future aircraft. The influence of Sophia's work had extended far beyond aviation into virtually every field that required high-stakes decision-making under pressure. Medical schools taught her decision-making frameworks to surgical residents. Business schools used her emergency landing as a case study in crisis leadership. Even NASA had incorporated her systematic approach to problem-solving into training programs for astronauts who might need to diagnose and resolve complex problems while operating millions of miles from Earth. The transformation of military aviation culture that Sophia had initiated was now complete. Young pilots entering the service had grown up learning that systematic thinking and careful analysis were essential components of airmanship, not optional add-ons to natural flying ability. The aggressive, instinct-driven approach that had once dominated fighter pilot culture still had its place, but it was now balanced by an equal emphasis on intellectual rigor and methodical preparation. During the graduation ceremony, Sophia was approached by Dr. David Chen, her father, who had flown from California to watch her address the newest class of Air Force officers. Now in his 70s, Dr. Chen had become something of a celebrity in medical circles for his presentations on systematic thinking in surgical practice, using his daughter's aviation experience to illustrate principles of decision-making under extreme pressure. Sophia, her father said, his voice carrying the same pride she had heard during their phone conversation so many years earlier. Your grandmother would be so proud to see what you've accomplished. You've proven that bamboo doesn't just bend without breaking, it can grow to support an entire forest. The metaphor was more apt than Dr. Chen might have realized. Sophia's systematic approach to aviation challenges had indeed grown into a comprehensive philosophy that supported aviators throughout their careers, from student pilots learning basic flying skills to senior airmen
commanders making strategic decisions that affected the safety and effectiveness of entire air forces. 15 years later, the memorial service for Staff Sergeant Lisa Williams was held at Edwards Air Force Base, where Williams had spent her entire career maintaining the aircraft that carried pilots safely through training missions and operational deployments. Now retired as Chief Master Sergeant Williams, she had remained at Edwards even after retirement, working as a civilian contractor and mentoring young maintenance personnel in the systematic approaches to aircraft care that she had learned while working with Sophia. General Sophia, now serving as Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations at Air Force Headquarters, delivered the eulogy for her former crew chief. Standing before an audience that included maintainers, pilots, and commanders from throughout the Air Force, Sophia spoke about Williams's dedication to the principle that systematic thinking and careful attention to detail were just as important on the ground as they were in the air. Lisa Williams understood something that took me years to learn, Sophia said, her voice carrying clearly through the base chapel. Excellence in aviation isn't just about individual performance. It's about creating systems and cultures that enable everyone to perform at their highest level. Lisa didn't just maintain aircraft, she maintained the standards that kept pilots safe and missions successful. Williams's funeral brought together many of the people who had played important roles in Sophia's journey from questioned pilot to senior Air Force leader. Colonel James Hartwell, now retired, spoke about how Williams had helped him understand that thorough preparation and systematic thinking were signs of professionalism rather than weakness. Senior Master Sergeant Patricia Wong, who had talked Sophia through her emergency landing so many years earlier, described how Williams had inspired an entire generation of maintainers to approach their work with the same careful attention to detail that had enabled Sophia to survive her crisis. The gathering also included several dozen pilots whose lives had been directly or indirectly saved by techniques they had learned through the Bamboo Protocol. They came from all branches of the military and several foreign air forces, united by their shared understanding that systematic thinking and methodical preparation could overcome challenges that seemed impossible to surmount through conventional approaches. During the reception following the service, Sophia was approached by a young Air Force captain whose face was unfamiliar but whose story was remarkably similar to her own. Captain Sarah Kim had successfully handled a hydraulic failure and landing gear malfunction the previous year, using techniques she had learned through the Bamboo Protocol to accomplish what investigators later described as a textbook example of systematic emergency response. "General Chen," Captain Kim said, her voice carrying the same quiet confidence that had characterized Sophia's own speaking style. "I wanted to thank you personally for the training that saved my life. When I lost hydraulics and gear last year, I remembered everything you taught us about breaking complex problems into manageable components. I didn't panic. I analyzed my situation systematically and executed the safest possible approach." Kim's successful emergency landing had been featured in aviation safety publications as an example of how proper training could enable relatively inexperienced pilots to handle situations that had once been survivable only by the most skilled and experienced aviators. Her success validated Sophia's belief that systematic thinking could be taught and learned, that the intellectual tools necessary for handling extreme challenges could be passed from one generation of aviators to the next. 20 years later, the ceremony dedicating the Sophia Center for Aviation Safety at the Air Force Academy marked the culmination of a career that had fundamentally transformed military aviation culture. Now serving as the Air Force's first female Chief of Staff, General Sophia watched as cadets, pilots, engineers, and commanders from around the world gathered to celebrate the opening of a facility that would train future generations of aviators in systematic decision-making and methodical problem-solving. The center housed the most advanced flight simulators available, capable of replicating not just Sophia's original emergency, but thousands of other scenarios that tested pilots' ability to analyze complex problems under extreme pressure. Students who trained at the facility
learned to approach aviation challenges with the same intellectual rigor that Sophia had applied during her crisis 20 years earlier. But they would also benefit from 2 decades of refinement and improvement in training methodologies. The dedication ceremony included presentations by aviation leaders from 37 countries, each describing how Sophia's systematic approach to emergency response had been adapted for their own unique operational requirements. The methodologies that had begun with one pilot's careful analysis of an impossible situation had evolved into a global standard for aviation safety and pilot training. Among the speakers was now Colonel Jennifer Martinez, who had commanded fighter squadrons in 3 different conflicts and was widely regarded as one of the most accomplished pilots of her generation. Martinez credited her success to the systematic thinking she had learned from Sophia during her cadet years, describing how methodical preparation and careful analysis had enabled her to excel in combat operations that demanded split-second decisions under life-threatening conditions. General Chen taught me that systematic thinking and aggressive action aren't opposites, they're partners, Martinez told the audience. The pilots who are most effective in combat are those who prepare most thoroughly, who analyze situations most carefully, and who execute their plans most precisely. The aggressive confidence that defines fighter pilot culture is most effective when it's built on a foundation of intellectual rigor and systematic preparation. The transformation that Martinez described had become the new standard throughout military aviation. Young pilots learned from their first day of training that careful thinking and thorough preparation were not signs of weakness, but sources of strength that could overcome any challenge. The systematic approaches that Sophia had pioneered were now so deeply embedded in aviation culture that pilots who had never heard of her emergency landing used her techniques routinely in their daily operations. As the ceremony concluded and guests toured the new facility, Sophia reflected on the journey that had brought her from a questioned pilot to the senior leader of the world's most powerful air force. The emergency landing that had once seemed like the end of her career had actually been the beginning of a transformation that extended far beyond her own professional success to encompass fundamental changes in how military organizations approached training, leadership development, and crisis management. The final speaker of the day was Dr. Jennifer Chen Williams, Sophia's niece and a recent graduate of the Air Force Academy who is beginning her own career as a pilot. Named after both Jennifer Martinez and Staff Sergeant Lisa Williams, young Dr. Chen Williams represented the next generation of aviators who would benefit from the systematic approaches that Sophia had developed and refined over 2 decades of leadership in aviation safety. "And Sophia," Dr. Chen Williams said during her remarks, "you've shown all of us that heroism isn't about dramatic gestures or exceptional courage. It's about careful preparation, systematic thinking, and the refusal to give up when everything goes wrong. The pilots who graduate from this facility will carry those lessons with them throughout their careers, and they'll pass them on to the pilots who come after them." As the dedication ceremony ended and the crowds dispersed across the academy grounds, Sophia stood alone for a few moments in the main training facility that bore her name. The building was filled with the most advanced technology available for pilot training, but its real purpose was to teach the timeless principles that had enabled her to survive her emergency so many years earlier: systematic thinking, methodical preparation, and the intellectual courage to analyze complex problems without being overwhelmed by their complexity. The small bamboo plant that Sophia had kept in her office for 20 years now sat in a place of honor in the center's main lobby, a living reminder that strength often comes from flexibility rather than rigidity, that the ability to bend without breaking can overcome challenges that defeat more traditionally aggressive approaches. The plant had grown significantly over the years, its roots extending deep into the soil while its branches reached toward the light, much like the influence Sophia had cultivated throughout her career. 25 years later. Problem: breaking it down into manageable components and analyzing each element methodically before moving on to the next step. The child had been named after Sophia's grandmother, the woman whose wisdom about bamboo bending but never breaking had provided the foundation for everything Sophia had accomplished in her aviation career. Now in her 80s, Sophia could see in her granddaughter the same careful thinking and methodical approach that had enabled her to survive her emergency landing and transform military aviation culture. The peaceful afternoon was interrupted by a phone call from the current Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Jennifer Martinez, who remained one of Sophia's closest friends despite the difference in their ages and career trajectories.
Martinez was calling to inform Sophia that the International Civil Aviation Organization had voted to name their highest award for aviation safety in her honor, the Sophia Medal for Systematic Excellence in Aviation Safety. "Sophia," Martinez said, her voice carrying the same warmth that had characterized their friendship for over 20 years. "This award recognizes not just what you accomplished during your emergency landing, but the entire culture of systematic thinking that you've built throughout the aviation community. Pilots around the world are safer today because of the principles you pioneered." The award was meaningful to Sophia, but not because it represented additional recognition for her own accomplishments. Instead, it validated her belief that the systematic approaches she had developed could be institutionalized and perpetuated, that future generations of aviators would continue to benefit from methodical thinking and careful preparation long after she was no longer available to teach them personally. As Sophia ended her phone conversation and returned to watching her granddaughter work through her mathematics problems, she reflected on the lesson that had guided her throughout her aviation career and her subsequent service as a senior military leader. The emergency landing that had defined her professional life had taught her that the most important challenges are often overcome not through dramatic gestures or exceptional individual performance, but through systematic thinking, methodical preparation, and the intellectual courage to analyze complex problems without being overwhelmed by their apparent impossibility. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Sophia's garden as she watched Eleanor solve her mathematics problem using the same step-by-step approach that had enabled her grandmother to land a damaged fighter jet 25 years earlier. The principles of careful analysis, systematic thinking, and methodical execution that had once saved Sophia's life had become family wisdom, passed down from one generation to the next like precious heirlooms that gain value through use. Sophia's legacy extended far beyond her own family to encompass thousands of aviators who had learned to approach challenges with the same intellectual rigor she had applied during her crisis. The Bamboo Protocol was now taught in flight schools on every continent, translated into dozens of languages, and adapted for use in fields ranging from medicine to space exploration. What had begun as one pilot's systematic approach to an impossible emergency had become a global standard for decision-making under extreme pressure.
As the sun set over the Colorado mountains, Sophia, the pilot who had once been dismissed as too fragile for military aviation, closed her eyes and listened to the sound of her granddaughter's pencil moving across paper, methodically working through each step of a complex problem. The quiet persistence that had once been seen as weakness had proven to be strength. The careful thinking that had been dismissed as hesitation had proven to be wisdom, and the systematic approach that had been questioned as insufficient had proven to be transformational. The too fragile pilot who had landed a damaged F-16 with no landing gear had done more than survive an impossible emergency. She had proven that heroism often looks different than popular culture suggests, that strength comes in many forms, and that the quiet courage to think systematically under pressure can overcome challenges that define more traditionally aggressive approaches. Her story had become legend not because of what she had done in one dramatic moment, but because of how she had transformed that moment into a lifetime of service that made countless other moments of heroism possible. The bamboo in Sophia's garden swayed gently in the evening breeze, bending with the wind but never breaking, growing stronger with each passing season. Like the woman who had chosen it as her symbol, the plant represented the power of flexibility over rigidity, the strength that comes from adapting to challenges rather than confronting them with brute force, and the wisdom of understanding that sometimes the greatest victories are achieved not through dramatic gestures, but through quiet persistence and systematic effort applied over time. In the gathering darkness, Sophia smiled as she listened to her granddaughter complete her mathematics problem, knowing that the principles of systematic thinking and methodical preparation would continue to guide future generations long after her own story had become just another chapter in the history of aviation. The legacy of the too fragile pilot who had accomplished the impossible would live on in every careful pre-flight inspection, every systematic analysis of a complex emergency, and every pilot who chose thoughtful preparation over dramatic improvisation when facing the challenges that define aviation as both science and art.